Welcome. Today we're going to talk about skeletal muscle structure. And as we know, muscles are organs that are composed of specialized cells that use chemical energy in the form of ATP to use that ATP to contract. And today we're going to learn how they are structured and how they coordinate or work with the nervous system in order to do their job. So why exactly do we have muscles in the body? What do they do for us? So probably the biggest thing that they do for us is they help us to move, and they help us to move in a number of different ways. And this is an advantage because there are a lot of organisms in the world that are sessile. They don't move. So movement is a big thing. It helps us to get resources. It helps us to find mates. And so the movement of our bodies is important in the way that we live our lives. The second biggest reason is to generate heat. And as you see, this person has just come off a nice run, and you can actually see steam leaving their body here because our muscles, because they are so active and doing so many chemical reactions, generate a lot of waste heat or heat in the process of, as a byproduct of their process of contracting. So that can help us to warm our bodies and maintain our homeostasis. The third thing muscles help us to do is to maintain our posture. So being able to stay upright and have muscle tone so that we can walk and stand and move around. So that's another big one. And then also they help us to generate our heartbeat, which is a big one. So we have our heartbeat. Which moves fluids through our body, which brings us to the last thing, and that is propelling or moving substances and liquids through our body. So moving of blood by the heart, and then also movement of food through our digestive tract, known as peristalsis, is another thing that smooth muscle helps us to do in our body. So speaking of smooth muscle, let's take a moment and talk about the three types of muscle found in the body. So first we have our skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscle is number one. So skeletal muscle is, and let's talk about location first, connected to bone. So it is all those muscles that attach to the number of different bones in our body. And skeletal muscle's primary job is to move our skeleton. And because it moves our skeleton, this type of muscle is called voluntary muscle, and that means that we are able to move it by thinking about it. And that's pretty important. So it's a voluntary muscle, and some other specific things about skeletal muscle is that it appears striped. And if you look up here, you can see that, and we'll talk about why that is in a second. And it also has multiple nuclei. And we'll talk about why that is a little bit later. So lots of different aspects of skeletal muscle there. Smooth muscle over here is located in the gut. So from our muscle all the way to our anus is all smooth muscle, and it helps us to propel food. So I'm going to write that up here. It also is not striped. So we're going to put not striped. It doesn't have a striped appearance. It's hence its name, and that's how it gets its name, smooth. One nuclei per cell, and as you can see, the cells are kind of slipper shaped here. And then the last thing is that it is involuntary. So it is a muscle that we cannot move by thinking about it. It doesn't respond to conscious thought. It is unconsciously moving in our body all the time. So we're always moving our food through our digestive tract. All right, and then lastly, we have cardiac muscle. I'm going to put a line here. And cardiac muscle is located in the heart. And its primary job is to beat our heart and help us move our blood. And it is also involuntary. In other words, we can't control it. Thankfully, our heart just beats even if we're asleep. And it is also striped in appearance, and a big aspect of, or a big unique characteristic of cardiac muscle, it has these junctions between its cells called intercalcated discs, and they appear as these darker stripes here. in between our muscle cells. And those intercalcated discs are what help us to relay the message to beat the heart fast enough so that the muscle can work in conjunction with those around it to make our heart beat. So 3 types of muscle there: skeletal muscle, smooth muscle, and cardiac muscle. And you should know a little bit about each one of them. All right, so let's talk about connective tissue attachment. So in other words, how does our muscular system or muscle tissue connect in our body to other things? And so the first way is in a cord-like fashion. And by cord-like, I mean kind of like a rope. It looks like a rope. And that is, for example, the fascia. And so fascia is the covering around muscles. What happens is that covering around muscles forms at the end. If you look at this muscle here, the sartorius muscle, longest muscle in the body, we see as it's coming down to the tibia here that it forms kind of this rope, almost like of white threads that attach to that tibia, also up here in the hip region, and those are what are the tendons. So fascia narrows at the end into this cord-like attachment that is a tendon, and then those tendons are what connect muscle to bone. So on bones we see tendons opening up into the muscle. And then the second type of attachment in the body is a sheet-like attachment, and that is called the aponeuroses. And aponeuroses are found, for example, in the abdominal muscles. And this is where we see sheet-like, so it's not rope-like, it's very flat. We see these sheet-like attachments of muscle to either, so aponeuroses connect muscle to bone, or, and this is a big one, muscle to muscle. So when we have muscle to muscle attachment, we're using these sheet-like or flat connectors. Okay, so those are the 2 ways that we kind of plug in muscles in the body: a cord-like, rope-like manner, and then a sheet-like, flat manner. All right, then let's talk about the other types of connective tissue coverings in the body around muscles. So here we see a picture of our muscles, and we start out at the bone, and like I said, here coming off of the bone is our attachment of our tendon, our cord-like structure, and then that tendon turns into what we call the fascia. So fascia is, again, covering around muscle, or muscle covering, and it's a connective tissue. Underneath of that fascia, that very thin kind of membrane, is what we call the epimysium. So the epimysium is a connective tissue covering what we call fascicles. And fascicles are bundles here of skeletal muscle fibers. So connective tissue covering muscle fascicles. Okay, and then moving a little bit smaller, so if we take one of those skeletal muscle fibers out here, or fascicles, and here we see it labeled, if we take one of those fascicles out and we look at it, it also is covered by a layer of connective tissue called the perimysium. So next up we have perimysium. So perimysium is covering one fascicle. So here we have the fascicle, and surrounding that fascicle we have the perimysium. And then if we look even closer and we look into that, we have what we call the endomysium. And the endomysium is the smallest of the connective tissue coverings. And those connective tissue coverings extend, or the endomysium extends from the perimysium into these little compartments that are basically each muscle cell. So the endomysium is the covering of muscle cells themselves. And so under that we would see the cell membrane around each of these muscle cells, because this muscle fiber is what is known as a muscle cell. And then into the muscle cell we see all of the thread-like structures that we'll talk about in a second. So from largest to smallest, we have the epimysium, the paramysium, and the endomysium. All right, so let's talk about how we order the muscle then. So what are those covering surroundings? So let's talk about that. So first we have the biggest, and that is the muscle. So that's where we have the whole unit here being attached to bone by the tendon. So that's pretty self-explanatory. But then we can get smaller and smaller and smaller here with our structures. So muscles can then be broken down into what we know as fascicles, and fascicles are basically bundles of skeletal muscle fibers. Bundles of skeletal muscle fibers, or cells, because a skeletal muscle fiber is a cell. And so then the next smallest thing is the muscle fiber, otherwise known as the cell. So again, this is the muscle fiber here. And if you'll see, the muscle fiber is made up of a bunch of things that kind of look like threads or cables. And so that next thing is called a myofibril. So a myofibril here is a bundle of proteins, basically. Bundle of muscular proteins. And the muscle cell is basically, as it says, the unit of the muscular system, okay, the muscle fiber itself. So when we think about muscular structure, I like to think of it like a cable, a large cable. And so if you look over here and you see this cable, you start out with one covering, which would be like the fascia of a muscle, and then under that covering you would have underneath of this cable plastic covering, you would have the epimysium, and then you start seeing the smaller fascicles, and those smaller fascicles, when you look at them, become individual threads here that are just like basically the threads that we see in each of the myofibrils that when we look at. So it's basically one structure that you can pull something out of, and then you can pull something out of again, like almost Russian nesting dolls. And each of these things sits situated in the larger structure. So know those structures. Know how each of them fits into the thing above it. In other words, know it from largest to smallest and smallest to largest. Okay, so let's do a self-check here and see if we can label all these different parts of the muscle, the structure of the skeletal muscle. So first, connecting to the bone, we have the tendon. So we have our tendon. And from the tendon, we widen out into what's known as the fascia, the covering for muscles, the connective tissue covering for muscles. And then when we have here, we would have our connective tissue covering surrounding the fascicles. So this is a fascicle. Okay, and then notice we're getting smaller and smaller as things are getting pulled out. Here we have, getting smaller, a muscle cell. So this fascicle is a bundle of muscle cells, okay, or muscle fibers. Remember, muscle fiber and muscle cell are used interchangeably. So this is the fiber, and I'm going to put in parentheses cell, so you remember that is the cell. And so if we look at the cell, we can see some components of it that are just like any other cell in the body. So this purple structure here that has a darker circular center is going to be the nuclei. So we're going to start seeing those multiple nuclei, because here we're looking at, if it's attached to bone, skeletal muscle. And then inside of that skeletal cell, we have all of these bundles of threads, basically, that we know as the myofibrils. Myofibrils. And then inside of the myofibrils, again, everything's being pulled out from the larger structure above it. We have the muscle filaments. So, know how to diagram this. Know how to draw this out. It asks you to draw it in your study guide. Really draw it out so that you know how each structure fits within the structure above it. Okay, so inside of the muscle myofibril, we talked about how, if you'll look, muscles appear striped. Skeletal muscles appear striped. So you can kind of see some striping right through here, although it's not readily apparent in this picture. And so what is it that makes skeletal muscle fiber appear striped? So that striped appearance comes from the proteins found inside of those myofibrils. So if I zoom in on this right here, this is what I would see. So I would see a thick structure here in the middle, and then surrounding that on either side, I would see thinner structures. And notice that there's places where there's only one versus the other. So right through here, I'm only seeing the thick protein, and then here, I'm seeing both of them. So that's going to help to contribute to the striped appearance of the muscles. Where I see all three here of the muscles at one time, that particular part of the muscle is going to appear very dark. And when I see just the thick, it's going to appear a little bit lighter. And when I just see just the thin here, it's going to appear even lighter than that. So that's going to create the banding pattern or the striped pattern that we see on the muscles. And we have two different proteins here that we are looking at. The first protein is called myosin, and myosin is known as the thicker of the two. And that's here. This is the thickest here if we were looking at the diameter. And so the myosin molecule is a bunch of little myosins strung together or flattened together in the middle. And then the second one that we are looking at here in terms of main proteins is actin. So we have myosin here, and then we have actin, which is the purple here, this purple thread. And actin is known as the smaller or thinner of the two. So myosin and actin are our two big proteins. And notice that the actin appears twisted, so we see this twisting happening. And then the myosin has these things that look like almost like the prong of the end of a power cord on the end of it that we call cross bridges. And so remember in biology that the shape of things help determine their structure. So these cross bridges and the way that this actin is twisted is going to come into play when we talk about how muscles contract or how they shorten. So we'll get back to that in a little bit. So let's look more closely at this striped appearance. So again, here we're looking at basically what we were just looking at, and that is the myosin and the actin filaments or threads sitting on top of one another. And so what you see from here to here is what we call the sarcomere. And the sarcomere is the unit of muscle. So this is what we call the building block of the muscle cell. And so a muscle cell will have many of these sarcomeres. So here's one and here's the second one, lined up end to end, all the way down through its myofibril. And so when we look at this, and like I told you before, there are places where we just see here the myosin protein. There are places where we see both the myosin and the actin protein, and then there are places where we just see the actin. So that's going to create these banding or these different colored or shades of banding in the muscle, and so that's why it appears striped. So it's the interaction of the proteins that creates the banding in muscles. And so we have some names for these different bands that you need to know, and in your notes it asks you to draw a picture of the sarcomere. So a sarcomere goes from what we call the Z line to the Z line. And the Z line is a zigzag line here that goes straight down through what we call the I band. So let's look at the I band first. So the I band, if you notice, is not particularly dark. It's the lightest purple that we have in this picture. And so the I band is just where we see, looking right here, it's just where we see the actin. So the I band is made up only of actin protein. And the Z line is what goes right through the middle of it, and it's where the actin attaches to itself. So we see this attachment here. So the Z line also, because it's a great place to start and stop, can tell us where the sarcomere starts and stops. The next part is what we call the A band. And if you look here at the A band goes from this all the way over to this. So it's a bigger band than the I band. And the A band is where we have overlap to overlap of the muscle proteins. So the A band is where we start to see actin and myosin. But if you'll notice, that's not always the case, because right in the middle there's a little part where it's just the myosin protein. And so we give that the name of the H zone. So the H zone is myosin only. Okay? And at the either ends, bookending that, is where we have that overlap. So we have overlap 2 and 2 proteins right here. So H zone, and then straight through the A band is the M line. And so the M line is the midline of the A band. So that's the middle of the A band. So go ahead and draw this right now in your notes, because you'll have to label this on your first muscular structure quiz. All right, so again, if you see up here, we're looking at a sarcomere, so we're looking at a unit of muscle. So that muscle is that sarcomere is going to go from the Z line to the Z line, okay, and that's what's going to give us that striping appearance. But there are some other parts that are pretty important to the muscle here as well. So first we have what's called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and if you remember from biology, that sounds a whole lot like the endoplasmic reticulum, and that's because it is. It's the endoplasmic reticulum of a muscle cell, and the job of the endoplasmic reticulum, if you remember from biology, is helping to move things around a cell, and that's exactly what the sarcoplasmic reticulum does. The sarcoplasmic reticulum is all about transport around the muscle cell. In addition, there are also some other types of transport. So the sarcoplasmic reticulum almost looks like a net, and it kind of goes and extends all over the myofibril. And then we have some more straightforward tubes that come in a vertical fashion that come across those myofibrils, and those are called the transverse tubules. So they transverse the length here of our myofibril. And the transverse tubules are also, again, for transport. So we're going to put transport for both of those. And then we have the nuclei. So here we have that purple, or what would appear purple if we took the membrane off. The membrane of the cell here, the muscle cell, is not the cell membrane. It's called a sarcolemma. So the sarcolemma is the cell membrane. And then we also have mitochondria, because as you know and remember from biology, the mitochondria is mighty, and that's what's helping to generate ATP. And the ATP is necessary for lots of different chemical processes and energy processing in the cell. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those when we talk about how muscles work instead of how they're structured. So those are the muscle cell parts. And then the last thing that we need to talk about is the structure of the nervous system part of the muscular system, because the nervous system is part of how the muscular system works. We have to have something that triggers movement of a muscle, and that comes from the nervous system. So we have this cooperation between the muscular system and the nervous system. And so when we see an area where these two come together is called the neuromuscular junction. So this is the meeting or the area where muscle and nervous system meet. And the portion of that is basically the neuron that controls muscle is called a motor neuron, motor for movement. So motor neuron is the neuron that controls muscle. And motor neurons have an end that can often look branched. So this is the motor neuron coming down to, this is our muscle fiber, muscle cell. And if you'll notice, it's kind of got a branched end here. And that branched end, we have a little kind of bulbous looking structure. And that bulbous looking structure fits actually into the sarcolemma, the cell membrane of the muscle cell. And right where we have that attachment of that motor neuron to the muscle cell is called the motor end plate. So the motor end plate is where the synapse, and we'll talk about what that is in a second, connects to a muscle. All right, so let's take a moment here and kind of zoom in and look at one of these motor end plates and look at what's happening in this motor end plate. Because one thing you'll notice, the motor end plate, we have lots of folds here in the cell membrane. And we also have a lot of mitochondria. And the reason that we have a lot of mitochondria there and a lot of these, this folding of the membrane is so that we can have a lot of absorption and we can have a lot of energy processing in this one spot. And that's going to be really important for us to quickly get a nerve signal to actually moving the muscle. So here it is blown up. And so what this is called is the synapse. And the synapse is the functional, or in other words, how the muscle cell and the nerve cell communicate. So this is the functional meeting of the nervous system and the muscular system. Functional meeting of muscular and nervous system. That's really sloppy. Sorry about that. And so the space here is part of that synapse. And that space is called the synaptic cleft. So the synaptic cleft is the space between So you can think of the synapse like the communication of the synapse, like you talking on your cell phone. You know, your mouth is usually not pressed right up against your phone, but yet the person on the other end can hear you. And it's kind of the same thing here. We don't actually have a physical touching between these two. The motor neuron is not actually touching the muscle cell. There's a small gap between. So what's happening? How can they communicate if they aren't actually talking? Well, it's much like you and your cell phone. What is being transmitted is something else. So in the case of your cell phone, it's your voice. In the case of a muscle, it's what we call a neurotransmitter. And so a neurotransmitter is a chemical that basically stimulates some kind of or transfers some kind of message over to whatever it is acting upon. And in this case, it's the muscles. So a chemical that acts as a messenger. So when we look at this in a muscle cell, what's going to happen is the nerve cell is going to secrete this chemical that is called the neurotransmitter. And that neurotransmitter is going to jump across this gap, this synaptic cleft. And on the other end here on our muscle cell, we're going to have little docking stations for this chemical. And when that chemical docks with its station and they connect, that's going to cause the muscle cell to do something. And that's going to start or trigger our muscle contraction. And we're going to look at how that works next time. But neurotransmitters are important, and we have many of them because each one is a separate message for something in the body. They control different things in the body. And so we have some special ones that are just used for the muscular system. Okay, so that ends our show for today. And so make sure that you've drawn your diagrams in your notes and gone back through and make sure that you have everything. And then you can go on and take your Quiz Star quiz on muscular structure.